The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him, though now long estranged. Man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused, the right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. How many of you think myths are true? You ever go to the movies, say superhero movies, or I don't know, Star Wars? Do you worry about whether or not those stories are true? I'm guessing not, probably, that most of you, however much you may or may not engage in cosplay or fan fiction, as we talked about last time, you're not going to the Avengers or to Star Wars. If you're still going to Star Wars at all, I stopped going with the Phantom Menace. Sorry. You're not going to those theatrical performances, those enacted dramas, with the expectation that the story that you're watching is true. So asking about whether or not myths are true, I mean, there are certainly strong arguments for making that our current modern fascination with fantasy stories or with science fiction, and certainly with superheroes and that kind of superhuman savior character are the are the myths of our days, the mythology of our day. If you have Wonder Woman, which I did love, I thought that movie was excellent. But say, Iron Man or Batman or Superman or Thor or all of those characters clearly participate in something that over the long tradition of human storytelling we would recognize as myth. But do we think of them as true? Well, you could say, well, of course not. Why not? They don't need to be true in order for us to gain value from them as stories. Well, what about Christianity? I talked in the last episode about the concern that theologians had in the early 20th century, particularly Rudolf von Bultmann, about demythologizing Christianity, because he was worried that insofar as the myth was seen to be necessary to the faith, people would lose faith, right? They'd end up secular atheists or moral, humanists, or worse. I don't know, leftists. Actually, that would be worse, and that should be in a whole nother episode. But if faith in Christ was dependent on believing in the tripartite division of reality between heaven, earth, and hell, with the earth in the middle, therefore Middle Earth. You hopefully see a little bit where I'm going. And in the belief in an actual incarnate deity who, came to Earth in some kind of spaceship. He actually came into the world through the womb of the Virgin Mary by a virgin birth, this miraculous birth, and that all of this mythology, Bultmann was intensely worried about. I'm losing my books. That's my Bible. Was worried that if Christians were required to believe this in order to feel that they were saved or understand that they were saved, and feeling and understanding are quite important there, then they would fall away from the faith. And it seems that was very much the struggle that Tolkien's friend Jack Lewis, C.S. Lewis, was having in 1931 when Tolkien and Lewis and their mutual friend Hugo Dyson took a little walk in the gardens at Magdalen College. And the conversation, based on what Lewis and Tolkien both wrote about it afterwards, seemed to revolve around this problem of whether myths were true. And Tolkien, as I read for you last time, wrote a poem, a very interesting poem, that he dedicated to, he said, to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. And we assume that this was Lewis. It seems that it was Lewis. And so what Lewis seems to have been arguing was, well, it doesn't matter even if they're beautiful, right? Breathe through silver. It's interesting. Silver is an interesting image there. You can say that breathe through the silver screen, even if you made them multi-million-dollar productions with CGI realism and brilliant acting and great music and hopefully good scripts, they'd still be lies, no matter how well crafted they were in the telling. And as far as Lewis was concerned at that time, that's what Christianity was. It might be pretty. It might have been well told over the centuries. It might have generated gorgeous art and magnificent music and impressive architecture, but it was still at root a lie, and he couldn't have faith in a lie. And so Tolkien writes this poem not just to make an argument for myth, right, which you could, I think, perhaps a little too easily mistake it, right? It's like he's talking about, it's Mythopoeia. I tend to say this Mythopoeia, which is probably wrong, but I think there's a truth in my mispronunciation a little bit. This Mythopoeia seems to be about myth making, but the conversation was about Christianity, and the conversation was about proving Christianity true. So clearly this poem is about more than just saying stories about Thor or stories about Superman or stories about Obi-Wan Kenobi can contain truth. For Tolkien, it's about the truth, right? It's about the ultimate truth. And what I'd like to talk to you about in this episode is what the argument he's making here, exactly what it means to make this argument that you need myth to access reality. You need myth to access the truth. So Tolkien is trying to convince us that the gospel is true. Let's start with the form that he made his argument in. Why write a poem, right? It's like, shouldn't you, if you were trying to convince someone of the faith, give a sermon, write a theological treatise, write a poem? And that's why I think my mispronunciation of Mythopoeia maybe not inspired, but just like accidentally significant, because I read it as mythopoesis, right? Making the poetry, myth poetry, right? The making of myth poems. So Tolkien he's thinking about making mythologies, thinking about telling mythological stories, but he's thinking about them as a problem of poetry. And the form that he gives his argument is I think extremely significant. And the form that he gave it is a poem in iambic pentameters. Everybody know what iambic pentameters are? You should, if you are schooled in English literature, because it's the standard meter for great epics, like, for example, Milton's Paradise Lost. Chaucer wrote in iambic pentameters. Many of Shakespeare's great monologues are in iambic pentameters. I have in my Telegram chat, we're studying right now, Alexander Pope, who was, I think, probably rightly considered the master of iambic pentameter. Certainly one of the greatest craftsmen in that meter from the 18th century. It's the meter that you're going to use if you want to make this kind of myth claim, right? This grand mythography, like Milton writing Paradise Lost. More to the point, Tolkien writes not just in iambic pentameter, which is ti-tum, 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 is the 5 feet, 10 syllables, 5 beats. So the iamb is ti-tum, and the pentameter is the 5 feet, and it marches on. The easiest way I always remember the meter is a loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou, right? So you have those 5 beats, and they kind of march in this lovely rising drumbeat, right? Although if you do it well, it's not quite so marchy as other meters. But what Tolkien does, not just in iambic pentameter, but he rhymes the end of each line. So it's technically heroic couplets, right? He's rhymed in couplets in iambic pentameter. So you open the poem with, "You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace, one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented cold inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain." He should have gotten your attention with the meter already, and the way he's playing with those rhymes: so, grow, pace, space, ball, mathematical, inane, slain. The end rhymes are drawing your attention to the final idea in each line, and he's clearly incredibly carefully crafted all of these rhymes as well as the lines so that something structural and delightful is happening in the poem itself. Now, it's an interesting length, and with one of the great things about iambic pentameter in this form is at least it just needs to be even lines, right? If you're doing heroic couplets, so pair, 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 pair. There are 148 lines. I started counting and I thought it would be 150, and it's not. It's 148, which is a sort of interesting number. It doesn't really divide by anything but 4, which is 37, and it's not 8, it's not 6, so it divides by 2, right? Let's leave that hanging a little bit. Why is it 148? And realize that just as the Anglo-Saxon poets, whom, of course, Tolkien spent his life studying, may have embedded significance in the structures of the poem. So I think Tolkien's probably doing it here, and therefore he's given us a riddle, right? He's given us a poem about myth making in heroic couplets and iambic pentameters with 148 lines. Who is he talking to? Now, we started with his epigraph, right? And he's saying, to one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. And the usual reading here is that he's simply talking to Lewis, who had been struggling with his atheism, particularly thanks to all the education that he'd had before he became a Don. And so that should be sufficient to explain who this person is that's saying myths are lies. But Tolkien and Lewis read a lot, and they certainly, being educated as they had been, they'd been reading not only myths and Icelandic. I mean that they actually formed the Inklings originally as the Kolbiters to be able to read these poems in Icelandic. They'd also, Tolkien says he read Gothic and Welsh and Old English, obviously, and many other languages, Italian and Spanish and such. But of course, both of them were trained in the classics, right? Greek and Latin. So underneath all of this, if they're worrying about mythology, they've got to be worrying about the classical mythology, and they're certainly, almost certainly, worried about the criticism that one of those great classic philosophers made about myth. We're talking about Plato, of course, who in the Republic, in Book 10 of the Republic, specifically makes an argument against myth, even more specifically against poetry, because it's usually understood he's talking about Homer, but he's making an argument against poetry. So here we have a poem in defense of myth against someone who's saying myths are all lies. It's an argument against the philosophers, right? This sort of mesomythos and philomythos, philomythos, philosophia, philosopher, right? He's a lover of myth, writing to a hater of myth, but he's defending myth against, I think, the wisdom of the philosophers, right? And you say this is a Christian argument, so if you're making a Christian argument, you're going to have to be ultimately, and this is why I was holding my Bible, coming up against what Paul argues in his first letter to the Corinthians about preaching Christ, right? We preach Christ crucified. Excuse me, previous line. This is First Epistle of Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 22 and 23. For both the Jews require signs, and the Greeks seek after wisdom, right? Sophia. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews indeed a stumbling block, and unto the Gentiles foolishness. And this preaching Christ crucified to the Gentiles is foolishness. Well, the Gentiles are the Greeks, and the Greeks are the great philosophers. He's been preaching to the Corinthians. He's trying to, the Pauline argument is trying to convince them of the truth of Logos. You guys have been listening to the Logos Rising arguments. And here, Tolkien, I think, is engaged in a similar sort of exercise of having to defend the foolishness of Christianity, of Christ, of the myth of Christ, against the wisdom of the philosophers. Now, Plato made a couple of different arguments against poetry. The two that matter for ours is, which I think Tolkien is certainly pointing to here, that myths, poetry, are lies, deceive, because they give images of things, not direct access, right? And this is that they're lies masquerading as truth, right? That they are, I'm not sure really Star Wars pretends to be truth, but there is that reality that, so we want to have our movies realistic. That's all the CGI, right? That they are masquerading as truth, and they're deceptive, as much because of their artistry as anything else, right? And so Plato was worried about that. He was also worried about the degree to which these myths undermine morality, because they are feeding, as he would put it, the rule of desire, right? This you think about going to the movies and you think about wanting to be in these stories. The movies are a good analogy for us because they are our theater, right? Most of us, you may go to the theater, but that's a sort of different exercise culturally now. Going to the movie, you are participating in the mythology of the larger culture, just as when the Athenians would go to the theater for their Dionysian festivals and they would see their plays, they are participating in that myth-making of their own city, right? And that Socrates is speaking, Plato is worried that these stories feed desire, rhetoric, I suppose, persuasion, lust, passions, rather than reason. So you have this tension between logos, the rational, the dialectical, and the rhetorical, the persuasive. I'm not sure whether I haven't read the Republic in a long time. I'm working to a certain extent off of some of the scholarship that I consulted for this episode. Desire here, suggests to me this problem of being absorbed into the story that we were talking about, and Plato is wanting to elevate philosophy, obviously. So, how do we arrive at truth? I think that's one layer of what Tolkien is answering here, because he's pointing to the Platonic argument that myths are lies. And so he's going to have to answer that there's a point to poetry, there's a point to artistry, there's a point to imagination that gets to truths that are not accessible simply through reason, right? That we need the rhetorical, we need the beautiful. But I think based on the kind of argument that he makes here, he's also pointing to something that, again, both he and Lewis would have been intimately familiar with as medievalists, which is the great debate from the scholastics over realism versus nominalism. Now, given that you all are very likely also readers of Umberto Eco, and if you aren't, you need to be, particularly The Name of the Rose, you may be familiar with this debate over the nominalists, between the nominalists and the realists. And in The Name of the Rose, I blend the movie and the book. Excuse me, I think the book's way better, but the movie is not terrible. The William Baskerville character, right, the Sean Connery Sherlock Holmes character, is a follower of William of Ockham, and William of Ockham was the great nominalist of the 14th century. And nominalism, if you follow any of the great Catholic trad cat discussions, is the great bugbear of modernity. And I've reading around in a lot of different aesthetic discussions, philosophical discussions, symbolic discussions, partly to prepare for my talking with you, but also as a foundation of this new work that I'm doing now on virtue and the imagination and training and poetry and so forth. And one of the best scholars I found so far is Stratford Caldecott, who I've been mentioning. He's also wrote a lovely book on Tolkien. And in this book, the Beauty in the Word, he's talking about the importance of the trivium, which are language arts in the classical curriculum, right? Grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And he has a very interesting discussion of the danger of nominalism that I just want to share with you here. So he's saying, in fact, much of the madness of the modern world, from which we hope to preserve our children by teaching them to think for themselves, can be traced back to a philosophical movement of the 14th century that rejected these principles, detaching thought from memory. Nominalists, such as William of Ockham, believed in naming, but thought of it as a purely human power, as the ability to stick labels on things, rather than to recognize their true nature. This is why they're called nominalists, nomens, they're namers, right? And they think of the naming exercise as simply labeling things. They don't think that the name itself points to a reality, and that's why in the name of the rose, right? That's the point of the title of the book, is pointing to this claim that the there's only a name, right? You've named it Rose, but that name points to nothing of its essence. There's no roseness behind the name. They rejected, this is Caldecott again, they rejected the reality of universals, such as man, lion, justice, and so on the grounds that only individual particular things exist. A lion, a man, a just act. Right, so this is why we call the debate between nominalists and realists. They're arguing over the existence of what they call universals, right? When I teach this in my Trivium course, we get into long arguments about genus and species and so forth. But the idea is that a name like lion, is there such a thing as lioness? And if you read Plato, you always end up pointing to chairs and talking about chairness and tableness and so forth. But that's why it's sort of interesting that on the one hand, I think Tolkien is worrying about the Platonic problem of myths being lies, but also there's this scholastic question of the degree to which names point to truth, which I think Tolkien does something yet again differently with, right? But I think that there's part of this here. And there is that problem of whether a universal, a name like man, lion, justice, actually points to a reality, or whether it's just a human sticker, like a post-it, right? More Caldecott. The universal idea is a fiction, according to the nominalists, by which we try to group disparate things under a single heading. In the end, even the individual thing was destined to fall apart into a flux of elements, parts of the body, phases of existence, moments of time. The self became as elusive as any other universal, any other label we affix to an ever-changing world, in order to impose some kind of order upon it for our own purposes. And then Caldecott gives a little anecdote of how he came to realize how evil this nominalism actually was. Some years ago, I was standing in what was left of the death camp of Auschwitz in Poland, when the full implications of what the nominalists had done finally hit me. No wonder the Jews could be treated as non-human if human is just a label we attach to a group of people we choose to relate to. And further, no wonder so many people have no problem with abortion if an embryo is just a cluster of cells to which we do not yet have to attach the label person. For philosophers such as Peter Singer, that label need not be attached until sometime after birth, making infanticide once more thinkable. In this view, we become more human as we build relationships and acquire consciousness and skills. A man in a coma, an old drunk on the street, a convicted murderer have no common humanity with a brilliant scientist or composer, a wealthy entrepreneur, or a young man with a wide circle of friends. There is no innate or infinite dignity attached to simply being human. Now, think about the implications of all of that and why we're in the culture wars we are right now, with people screaming over whether or not you have to recognize their pronouns. Now, from one side of the argument, it's like they are denying reality, right? They're denying the bodies that they were born in, and I've talked about that already. This sort of sense of being incarnate, physically real because of our existence in bodies. But on the other hand, the anxiety that they have about, I don't exist unless you label me the way I want to be labeled. It's like it's this disease of nominalism, right? It's this disease, it's the same sort of problem as whether or not you label the unborn baby a baby. If you call it a clump of cells, it's no longer anything you need to worry about if you say it's a baby. And thus we are fighting the problems of the 14th century now in our disagreements over the reality of the human, right? Based on this problem of these names. So now, if you think about it, the exercise that Tolkien is engaged in this poem in defending myth becomes an exercise in defending, I mean, you could say that the sort of banal version of it is all of tradition in Christianity, reality against the sophistry of saying nothing exists. Well, and this is where it gets, unless you label it, and this is why I think we have the nominalists on one side saying names are just labels, and we have Plato on the other side saying forms exist and they're real, and if you name things, they point to real forms. But we also have Plato worrying about the reality that you point to through stories and myth, and the sort of the fear of the imagination, the fear of the creativity that poets engage in crafting their art. And then here comes Christ, right? Like down into the midst of these various binaries to say reality is something, tripart, instead of this flat world that we all think we live in, that's only the only sensory reality we have. Here comes the transcendent descending into our experience by way of the incarnation. That is what Tolkien is trying to convince Lewis is actually true. So how does he try to convince Lewis? And say he's written a poem, and I think I probably need to hold off on fully explaining the full significance of poetry to a subsequent episode, because we're also going to talk about music and creativity through music. But the primary thing you need to recognize is that poems are words plus numbers, right? That we think of them, you can think of them primarily as a linguistic artifact, a thing that you make with words, but you make them by counting the feet. The rhymes are like musical notes, right? The sounds, the phonemes that you can experience in your body and your hearing, the taste that Tolkien said that the languages have that we talked about last time. And so poems are these sort of musical compositions, and composition is very important there because they're structured. That's why I think it's the pentameters and 148 lines that really matter here for Tolkien. So they're like the wedding of both the trivium and the quadrivium. They're the wedding of the language arts, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, with the quadrivium, which is arithmetic, it's like number sequence, geometry, numbers in space, music, numbers in time, and astronomy, numbers in the, the sort of complex of creation, right? The structure of creation. So that Tolkien wrote a poem shows you that he's also thinking about music of creation. Hint. You all know the onion then delay. And of course, the poem is about naming. So there's lovely meta levels that he's working on in giving you this poem to make his argument about the reality of the stories. There's another element to it that it's significant that it's a poem, because of course one of the the joys of Tolkien's own craft is that he's writing stories, but he's writing stories about a culture that is itself telling stories, right? So, and I do believe I've talked about this a number of times. I'm going to just reinforce certain things several times so you realize what's going on, the layering of storytelling, so that Aragorn tells the hobbits the story of Beren and Luthien, and they find themselves within that story. Well, you're within a world of storytelling. For example, the Hall of Fire at Rivendell, or Meduseld, which is the mead hall where the Rohirrim tell stories. And going back to the tradition that Tolkien is always hearkening to, always layering on, calking, it's the technical thing, sort of layering his own craft onto, is of course the Anglo-Saxon storytelling tradition. And in Beowulf, if you know that poem as well as Tolkien did, it opens with Hrothgar, of course, building a great mead hall where the bard sings stories. And the story that the bard sings when in Herot at the opening, it's the story that gets Grendel all mad at him and everything, is the Song of Creation. And we know from the history of Old English literature, Old English poems, that the earliest poems that were ever composed in Old English were about creation, the Song of Creation. So we're several layers down now to Tolkien has sung a song for his friend to convince him of the reality of the creation that he is describing in his poem. How does creation work? Well, if he's singing the story of creation, I think we're just going to have to sing it with you. And I want to draw your attention to the deep structure of the argument that he's making and show you that he needed to do it in poetry in order to make the argument that he did. So, Mythopoeia. You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star is a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical. Amid the regimented cold inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. That's saying, look, you look at trees and you label them just like the nominalist, right? That's just a name. It's a tree. And growing is to grow, and all you think is that you've labeled them. That there is no reality behind the name that you've given. It's just the sticker, the post-it note you've stuck on them. And that when you're walking, you're walking the earth and treading with solemn space, you think of it as simply minor globe in the cosmos, or not even cosmos, just space, right? And he says that. He says space, not cosmos or universe. It's just extension of space and time, right? And so it's interesting. I was telling you about this is an argument about the trivium and the quadrivium, deeply involuted, right? That he's showing you how modern people tend to think in terms of measurement. The course is mathematical, right? The globes are the planets in the solar system are simply moving through space according to courses that they've been described mathematically by, and it's just matter in a ball. There's no essence to it, just no essence, just existence, right? Just material existence that happens to take in a particular shape and can be described with mathematical equations. Regimented cold inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain, things come into being and go out of being. Existence, right? Existence. And see, I can't, it's very hard for me even just to keep as bland a language as Tolkien is using here to show, you say these lies are you say these myths are lies. This is the world you live in, this cold, regimented, capitalized inane, just empty space. At bidding of a will to which we bend and must, but only dimly apprehend, great processes march on as time unrolls from dark beginnings to uncertain goals. As on page or written without clue, with script and limning packed of various hue, an endless multitude of forms appear, some grim, some frail, some beautiful, some queer, each alien, except as kin from one remote origo, gnat, man, stone, and sun. God made the petrious rocks, the arboreal trees, Tellurian earth, and stellar stars, and these homuncular men who walk upon the ground, with nerves that tingle, touched by light and sound. The movement of the sea, the wind and boughs, green grass, the large, slow oddity of cows. Thunder and lightning, birds that wheel and cry, slime crawling up from mud to live and die. These are each duly registered and print the brain's contortions with a separate dent. I think the large, slow oddity of cows is one of my favorite phrases ever. So it's interesting now that Tolkien's brought in this bidding of a will to which we bend and must, but there's therefore necessity. I think it's not clear to me that he's bringing in God's will at this point. It's just there is this will, and we may or may not be able to attend to it. I think perhaps here he's also playing off of this sort of lazy deism that people often philosophically fall into. It's like, well, I can't really believe in creator, but maybe there's a E. Michael Jones has talked about the way Newton sets up love and strife as gravity and inertia, right? And she's like, we're in this kind of regimented space, the cold regimented space, and we're all stuck in it. I don't know why Tolkien put will there, but that's interesting. Great processes march on, time unrolls from meaningless dark beginning to who knows what, right? And there's no meaning whatsoever in any of this. And again, I feel like Tolkien's teasing by talking about page or written without clue, with script and limning packed of various hue. Are we in a book? I mean, you would think that a book would have a certain degree of significance and story, but he's denying all of that, right? There's no story, there's no purpose or meaning, just mechanism. And this endless multitude of forms, that's where I'm a little curious about where Tolkien is falling in his conversation with Plato here, right? Because forms are usually the thing we associate it with the Platonic ideas, right? That we have these forms, and somehow he's sort of pointing to this, well, they just show up, right? We're not talking creator, we're not talking maker, we're not talking artisan of any sort. They just happen. And they have various characteristics: grim, frail, beautiful, queer, all alien from each other, right? Disconnected, atom-like, right? There's no relationships that any of them have. The only kin they have is that maybe they're from this remote origo. I think that's why he's playing off this sort of deist kind of nonsensical origin stuff, just mechanistic and clockworky, right? Gnat, man, stone, and sun, they're indifferently related. Now, Tolkien is sort of teasing here. Petrious rocks, we got the adjective with the noun. Arboreal tree, Tellurian earth, stellar stars. Adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun, adjective, noun. That they're themselves. They're sort of mirroring, they can be nothing but trees, right? He's basically saying God made the rocks, rocky rocks, trees, earthy earth, starry stars, and homuncular men, right? That they are just but the thing is, I always like that passage too, because Tolkien actually believes in adjectives, as you'll learn, particularly when we talk about fairy stories. So that he's teasing here, I think, with what he wants to say. It's like, well, how can they have characteristics, and God made them, and not be meaningful? And the men walk upon the ground, and we are able to perceive things through our senses, tingling, touched by light and sound, right? Your eyes and your ears can perceive these forms, can perceive the sort of stuffliness of them, and that's that. And so you have, all of these different, I don't want to say creatures yet, because he hasn't defined them quite as creatures, although he did say God made them, right? The sea moves, the wind moves, green grass, cows, thunder and lightning, the birds, slime, all are duly registered and make like sense impressions. This duly registered imprint the brain's contortions with a separate, you can perceive them. So he sort of got Lewis, or the Platonic listener, to the point of philosophy, right? It's like you recognize that all of these things exist, you can perceive them with your senses, and I mean there is a kind of challenge here, and it's like, that's it, that's what you are. You really, it's like, truly that is all that you are, that's all that you want to be, that there is nothing meaningful, I mean, story-like about your existence. And then he issues this great challenge. Yet trees are not trees, right? You think you could just stick the labels on them and think, I mean, he hasn't even got to thinking yet. You perceive them, you've stuck labels on them. Yet trees are not trees until so named and seen. And this is where I'm a little curious about where the realist and nominalist argument is playing off here, because he's saying it's only when we, with our consciousness, look at the trees and name them that something kind of magical happens. Yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named, till those had been whose speech's involuted breath unfurled faint echo and dim picture of the world. But neither record nor photograph, being divination, judgment, and a laugh, response of those that fell to stir within by deep monition movements that were kin to life and death of trees, of beasts, of stars. Free captives undermining shadowy bars, digging the foreknown from experience and panning the vein of spirit out of sense. Great powers they slowly brought out of themselves, and looking backwards they beheld the elves, that wrought on cunning forges in the mind, and light and dark on secret looms entwined. Something magical just happened there. And this Tolkien's trying to, there's a way in which he's doing both dialectic and rhetoric here. He's trying to make you think philosophically and be drawn in and persuaded by his poetry, so that you realize there's no way out of your understanding. And in this, he's first gesturing to the primary activity of human beings. And if you know Genesis, you know that the first thing that Adam does, God brings the animals to him and he names them, right? So we'd say human beings, our consciousness does something that works on creation. No, so you're not talking about creation yet. Works on this material reality to give it something else, right? Trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been whose speech's involuted breath unfurled. God breathes into Adam and gives him life, right? And then my speaking to you, my breath that I have to send out of my body, is an expression of my perception and my consciousness and my understanding, faint echo and dim picture of the world. That somehow in speech and naming we're giving a reflection, an echo, sound, and a picture, a representation of that thing named. And Tolkien, as I'm thinking of all the different categories of things that we were going to talk about, what magic is, right? And magic, in his understanding, is this working with the materials of the world. And he denies at certain places that it's actually power over the world. It's working with the materials, loving the materials of the world, and crafting things from them. And he's thinking, I think, here of the way in which that naming exercise works with the world. This great power that you bring out of this exercise of naming. Look backwards and beheld the elves. And I like that he thinks about looking backwards, right? Suddenly, because he's playing off of that sense that maybe there are other rational creatures that we could have conversation with. He and Lewis were very interested in that possibility, but that it's only after human beings have been doing this for a while, naming things, telling stories, that they perceived the elves, and they perceived it as something that had been there all along, right? The looking backwards, and that there had been this exercise of forging, right? Cunning forges in the mind. It's like we're here in the forge of Tolkien, understanding this exercise of storytelling and crafting artifacts through our use of language. Light and dark on secret looms entwined, forging in textiles, this metalwork and cloth work creates what, right? Does it create in opposition to what God made, or does it do something else? And here Tolkien is now saying we're participating in this creative work somehow, right? He sees no stars, who does not see them first of living silver, made that sudden burst to flame like flowers beneath an ancient song, whose very echo after music long has since pursued. There is no firmament, only a void, unless a jeweled tent, myth-woven and elf patterned, and no earth, unless the mother's womb whence all had birth. Now, that's a very interesting claim that Tolkien's making, saying that basically stars, firmament, and earth don't exist unless they're part of our myth making. That they exist insofar as we perceive them. I don't think. I mean, he's not saying like the only it's not reality is only that which we perceive, or that it's our perception that brings it into being. There's some way that he's trying to grasp this sense that you can't, I suppose you can't be talking about walking on the earth unless you're already in this story world. Whether that means, the myth is coeval with the human mind. He'll say in On Fairy Stories that there is a way in which our perception of the stars and the earth is already part of myth making, right? We don't see them without naming them and turning them into flowers of the firmament, or the jeweled tent, myth woven and elf patterned. It doesn't exist at all, or you can't see them at all unless they're part of a story. Maybe perhaps that's close. You can't. Our minds are so made that we don't see things unless we're already telling stories about them. And that will be, in fact, what Owen Barfield, their friend, argues in Poetic Diction. Again, it's a poem, right? That our very consciousness is about the coming to realization of this being in the story. I'm struggling here a little bit because I'm trying to get to that. We want a proof that Christianity is real, and you want to not be able to, you want to have something stronger than saying, I believe in a sky fairy, and and it makes me better. I intensely, as a Christian, dislike utilitarian arguments about Christianity that, Christians are, it's good to be a Christian because we just all behave better. That's not enough, right? The morality argument, the utilitarian morality argument, is not sufficient. It is true that if you understand yourself and feel yourself and can participate in our existence with this vision that Tolkien's trying to give his friend Lewis, we will behave better, because suddenly you realize how significant everything is, right? You want to be a part of this great gem in all of its crystalline brilliance and magnificence, and you do want to be as, sort of transparent and beautiful and lovely as God has made you to be, then you'll behave well, right? But saying that is the reason to be Christian is like getting it completely backwards, and also sort of ugly to me. It's this utilitarian, it's only functionally good, right? And you might as well be a machine if that's it, right? It's like, okay, so we'd all be better off if we were just robots and all behaved well, with maybe Asimov's rules about robot morality, right? No harms to human. That is not sufficient. And I think Tolkien would, given the way in which he thinks about the problem of mechanization, would be quite adamant against that argument, that we're trying to see ourselves into this beauty. Again, that's why it's a poem. You must see yourself in this beauty to know who you are, right? Here's a passage I read at the beginning of this episode. The heart of man is not a compound of lies. We're not making all of this out of these stories out of just, again, I think the utilitarian argument about we will behave better if we have this story is one of those kind of reverse lies, right? Plato was worried that poetry was making people immoral because it feeds desire, and you could say certainly Hollywood, with its mythologies, is feeding desires, some of which are satanic, most of which are satanic because they're about world dominion, right? And Tolkien is definitely against that. Again, we're this riddle that he's giving us, and which he wrote in 1930, is pointing us to everything that shimmered out of his own crystal storytelling. That we're not compound of lies. The story that we find ourselves in is not a lie, but draws from wisdom from the only wise. This is Christ. The wisdom that Christ that we're living in is drawing from God, right? And still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Now here's the fall, right? And Tolkien is going to be emphasizing this very Catholic perception instead of the total depravity of Tulip, right? The Calvinist understanding that we're totally depraved and fallen. The Catholic understanding is more that we're still participating in what we were made, not wholly lost nor wholly changed, disgraced, and the way Tolkien spells that is important. Graced. So we were disgraced, loss of grace. He may be. We may not be fully in grace, although if you're baptized, you've been given the gift of grace. Yet is not dethroned. Adam was given dominion over the animals, and the earth, and we're not dethroned from that dominion, interestingly, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Even expelled from the garden and disgraced, man is still in dominion in a certain sense. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact, and artifact is capitalized, and therefore it means heaven and earth, right? It's not ours to worship the thing that God made. We don't worship creation, the great artifact. We participate in it. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. I mentioned that I was watching Corey Olsen's lecture for this, and he does a lovely job with this crystalline image. I do recommend his lecture, where he's thinking about the way in which we are like, I think, diamonds. So the Silmarils are very diamond-like, but we are the white light, the single white, capitalized, right? The light, the sunlight, the white light shines through all of us, and each one of us is like a different gemstone. And this imagery is very medieval, and it's very heavenly in its imagination. Tolkien's probably getting this from his reading of Pearl, another of his the Middle English poems that he translated that we will talk about. But we're getting this image of light shining through each of us, say shining through our soul, but also, incarnately through our bodies, through our ability to make things in the world. And this is what I got from Olson, that each of us splinters it out, right? Refracts that white light into different hues, to many hues. Each of us, imagine, ideally in the mythology of the heavenly Jerusalem, the bodies of the saints will all be gem-like in heaven, and the heavenly Jerusalem's got gemstone walls, and so you've got loads and loads of different gemstones, and every human soul, it's a lovely image, every human soul is a different gem, and the light of God shining through each of us refracts into a color that is specially ours. Again, that's Olson. I'm borrowing off of him and saying, I need his light. Hopefully I'm giving you some of my light. You would read maybe even Tolkien's poem a little bit differently, and it's your light, or you write your own poem, and we refract out. And it's only through all of these refractions that we see the brilliance of the full brilliance of creation, and that we are part of that, right? Subcreating by way of allowing God to work through us, allowing our own imagination, and you realize this is all, in fact, a poem about the imagination, all participating in that making, so that we're not just, machines blundering around amidst rocks and trees and cows and slime mold, but we are, and we're not meant to be, forcing the other creatures to become something they're not, but we are making the whole of creation all the more beautiful by being part of it. And in this, Tolkien is very, very Catholic in the sense that he's understanding all of us is necessary, just as the great range of saints is all necessary to our seeing the brilliance of God through their relationships with him, that each of us has our own relationship to God, and that is our particular soul color, as it were. And that in these many hues, they're combined, they're shared out in our language, in the art that we make, in the stories that we tell, and pass from mind to mind through all these different hues, right? It's this glorious rainbow. That rainbow image used to be about the covenant that God made with Noah, right? Remember this glorious rainbow of making. And through all the crannies, though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sow the seed of dragons, 'twas our right, used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. It's in that sort of the subcreation law, right? We are made to be makers. We are made to, we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we mirror God in our own creativity, in our own storytelling, in our own myth making, in our own poetry. So you see that Tolkien he's making a very powerful argument against the philosophical claim that reason is sufficient, right? That we do need this persuasion and beauty and artistry and music and poetry. Plato later goes on about the importance of music, and we'll get to that too. But that we need more than just reason, and we need more than just science, obviously. We need the poetry of this refracted light to be fully human, because we're made by a great artist. Yes, wish fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts and ugly fact defeat. Of course we do, right? Fact, this barren, empty, cold, lifeless thing. Of course we want to escape from a world in which we're nothing but bodies that have no meaning, that you can kill in the womb regardless, right? If you've not stuck the label human on us. Whence came the wish, and whence the power to dream, or some things fair and others ugly deem? How do we know what's beautiful or not if we're not part of that beauty? All wishes are not idle nor in vain. fulfillment we devise, for pain is pain, nor not for itself to be desired, but ill, or else to strive or to subdue the will alike were graceless, and of evil this alone is dreadly certain, evil is. If, in fact, we are not made by this creator to participate in this creation, if we don't have a meaning in this story, there's no, it's either to strive or to subdue the will alike were graceless. Either that, that we are, well, there you get to the point of the morality of it, that in order to understand true morality, you have to participate in this exercise of imagination and naming and know your reality as a soul, as a sub-creator. Otherwise, well, yeah, clumps of cells. Blessed are the timid hearts that evil hate, that quail in its shadow and yet shut the gate, that seek no parley. And in guarded room, though small and bare, upon a clumsy loom weave tissues gilded by the far-off day, hoped and believed in under shadow's sway. Blessed are the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary towards a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guest, by faith. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. It is not they that have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight in lotus isles of economic bliss, for swearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, and counterfeit at that machine-produced bogus seduction of the twice seduced. I think that's one of the most sort of just. This is the satanic reality that you're in if you don't believe in the myths, if you don't participate in the stories. It's not the legend makers with their rhymes that are forgetting who we are and what we are. It is not they that have forgot the night. You don't understand, you're not going to recognize evil properly without this exercise in storytelling. It's not the legend makers that bid us to flee to organized delight or lotus isles of economic bliss. Have you heard anything? Have you ever heard a better description of the Prometheans, right? They're forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, pay for that lotus eating, that pleasure, that economic, control that you've given your soul over to. It's not the legend makers that are engaging in that Promethean denial of our humanity, but the ones who don't have any sense of our role as poem makers. They've sold their souls. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre, and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now, and dark hath been with light of suns, as yet by no man seen. These themes are going to be important to Tolkien, to this need to carry on even though it just feels hopeless, right? The myth makers see death and yet carry on. And in that sense, there's more layered in here. We'll talk about some more. It's like whether or not fairy stories are kind of escape, right? And he's arguing against that. It's not escapist. It's confronting death and evil and not giving into this idea that we're simply machines, right? I would that I might with the minstrels sing and stir the unseen with a throbbing string. I would be with the mariners of the deep that cut their slender planks on mountains steep and voyage upon a vague and wandering quest for some have passed beyond the fabled west. I would with the beleaguered fools be told that keep an inner fastness where their gold impure and scanty, yet they loyally bring to mint an image blurred of distant king, or in fantastic banners weave the sheen heraldic emblems of a lord unseen. So emphasizing again, this is a song and he's longing to be with the minstrels that sing about this quest. Again, I'm playing off of Olson a little bit here, where pay attention to the mint of image of blurred of distant king, that you are crafting out of the gold that you get, and you're forging coins made in the image and likeness of the creator. We'll talk about that more. So he's building up to his conclusion now and saying, I don't want any, you see who we are if we allow ourselves this exercise of subcreation. I will not walk with your progressive apes, erect and sapient. So much. One, this is clearly going against this insistence on evolution as the myth that we actually live by. And Lewis actually wrote an essay about evolution as the modern myth. Everything evolves. Everything has to progress and become. And Tolkien saying, you erect and sapient, Homo erectus and Homo sapiens, obviously, but also this sense of, you're going to progress to what future? Before them gapes the dark abyss to which their progress tends. There's no point to it. Progress. That Circe kiss that you've sold your souls for, which is simple material progress to what? To meaninglessness. It has no human point unless you're engaged in this myth making. If by God's mercy progress ever ends and does not ceaselessly revolve the same unfruitful course with changing of a name. He's pointing to all, this is 1930, right? So all of these labels are just as fraught at the time then as they are for us now. Progressives, revolution, right? Revolution simply going to say, we're going to revolve around space, and our economic systems will revolve. Nothing means anything. I will not walk. I will not tread your dusty path, and flat denoting this and that by this and that. It's sort of naming that claims not just no universal existence, but no participation in the beauty of the creatures. Your world immutable, wherein no part the little maker has with maker's art. I bow not yet before the iron crown, nor cast my own small golden scepter down. Now, the iron crown is obviously in Tolkien's mythology going to be Morgoth's crown. The golden scepter, I think, is rather interesting, because the first thing that I think of with a golden scepter image is the scepter that the king holds out to Esther to give her a boon, but I have to meditate on that a little bit more. Where do we end up if we participate in the reality of this myth that is the making, the myth of creation with us as namers and made in the image and likeness of God? In paradise, perchance the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day. It's the beatific vision that what we will be in paradise is looking upon the face of God, to see the day illumined and renew from mirrored truth the likeness of the true. Mirroring and reflections and refractions are very, very important. Then looking on the blessed land, we'll see that all is as it is, and yet made free. Free will is going to be another very important theme for us. Salvation changes not, nor yet destroys garden nor gardener, children nor their toys. Being saved doesn't mean we stop getting to make stuff, right? So don't worry, it's not going to be boring. And I do like the way Vox has talked about, maybe we don't know what heaven's going to be like, next story, next level, we'll level up. And Tolkien would agree, right? Salvation changes not, nor yet destroys garden or gardener, children or their toys. We'll get to play some more. In fact, we'll get to play even better. Evil it will not see, for evil lies not in God's picture, but in crooked eyes, right? It's not in what God makes that is evil, but in our misseeing, right? A lot of this is all about seeing and perception and storytelling, but it's like evil is something that we bring to the scene, not in the source, but in malicious choice, not in sound, but in the tuneless voice. We're singing. Song is very important here, and evil is in not going along with the song. That's foreshadowing. In paradise, they look no more awry, and though they make anew, they make no lie. So we'll continue making, but in paradise, I guess unlike now, everything will be made true instead of warped or broken. Be sure they still will make, not being dead. And poets shall have flames upon their head, and harps whereon their faultless fingers fall, there each shall choose forever from the all. They still will make, not being dead, so will be alive in heaven, still making. Poets, right? This whole poem has been about poets making with inspiration, right? And the flames upon their head is obviously reference to the flames that descend upon the heads of the apostles at Pentecost when they're filled with the Holy Spirit and the ability to speak in all the languages of humanity. And remember that one of the things that we talked about last time, Tolkien is very delighted by, is this multiplicity of flavors of languages, right? And he's saying the poets will be filled with this inspiration at Pentecost, this naming, this language, and will be singing. Harps whereon their faultless fingers fall. They'll make this perfect harmonious music. So trivium and quadrivium together, numbers and words, and the poets are going to be playing their harps and choosing forever from the all. So that was Tolkien's argument to his friend Lewis, that what they were engaging in as storytellers was in fact this exercise in participating in creation, carrying on with the naming that Adam had been given in as the gardener, right? He's created to take care of the animals in the garden and to have dominion over them. And that exercise of naming and storytelling is part of what we're made to be, right? Because we subcreate, we tell stories, and our storytelling is part of God's storytelling, which is therefore part of creation, and that we do this, we'll be doing this in heaven as well. Which makes it all, in Tolkien's understanding, not just here we have a moral truth, which we do have moral truths in, choice and free will and choosing well, which will also be very significant part of the problem for him, but that we are true, so morally and like beyond philosophically, right? The stars are not real unless they're part of the story, right? They're not real simply because you've named them or understood them or done logical properties with them, but they're real and true because you are engaged in this storytelling. Yeah, I'll leave you to be mulling over that, whether Tolkien has persuaded you yet that the myths are real, because what he needs Lewis to believe is that Christianity is true beyond just a convenient story, right? It's not just convenient and morally good, and you may get some nice philosophical principles about reason from it. It's true down to its bones of we were made from the dust of the garden and life breathed into us, and that makes us who we are. Why 148 lines? I promised you the solution to the riddle. Well, here is Psalm 148. Praise ye the Lord from the heavens. Praise ye him in the high places. Praise ye him, all his angels. Praise ye him, all his hosts. Praise ye him, O sun and moon. Praise him, all ye stars and light. Praise him, ye heaven and heavens, heaven of heavens, and let all the waters that are above the heavens praise the name of the Lord. For he spoke, and they were made. He commanded, and they were created. He hath established them forever, and for ages of ages. He hath made a decree, and it shall not pass away. Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons, and all ye deeps. Fire, hail, snow, ice, stormy winds, which fulfill his word. Mountains and all hills, fruitful trees and all cedars, beasts and all cattle, serpents and feathered fowls, kings of the earth and all people, princes and all judges of the earth, young men and maidens. Let the old with the younger praise the name of the Lord, for his name alone is exalted. The praise of him is above heaven and earth, and he hath exalted the horn of his people, a hymn to all his saints, to the children of Israel, the people approaching up to him. Alleluia. Tolkien in Mythopoeia invites us to make the praise of the Lord of creation, the one in whose image and likeness we are made, and who we are called in Psalm 148, it's one of Tolkien's favorite psalms, to praise as the Lord of the dragons. That's the riddle that we're going to be trying to answer throughout our discussions, this sense of myth as real and true, and not just fairy story, but as real down to the sense of who we are as creatures made as artists in the image and likeness of God. Come, let's make things and praise sing with the dragons. How's that? I'll see you next time.